So just a few logistics before the normal virtual housekeeping before we get into it is we are recording this session, and we'll record this, that we'll share the full recording, and also the upcoming white paper that a lot of this content is based on, and relevant resources after this. We've encouraged the town hall, our philanthropic friends, to share resources as they think of them during the conversation. We've already identified a few. And so they'll be sharing things in the chat, but we'll compile everything and share all of this afterwards. And because this is a conversation, we encourage you to chat in your questions. Use the chat window, not the Q&A window, but the chat, to please enter your questions, your challenges, your struggles as we go. You don't have to wait until the end or the certain breaks. I will offer a reminder to do that, but it's open. The chat line is open, and all of us will be monitoring that as we go and trying to address as many as we can. And before we kick it off, last thing is to please let us know who's here. We want to ask everyone to please just type into the chat an introduction and just let us know your name, your organization, number 2, and number 3 is what are you hoping to get out of this session? Okay, so those 3 things. So we know who is showing up today. So I'm going to move on to today's takeaways. 4 main things that we want to leave you with before you head out. And number 1 is basic strategy principles for advancing equity and justice, a macro view that can hopefully help you increase your clarity, connect various dots, and tell a coherent story around this work, how strategy can link your other efforts related to equity and justice to action and results. 2 examples are evaluation and then maybe your DEI efforts. And most of what we would hope to address today is a town hall, which is leaving you with real life examples and learning from what's working, answers to your questions, and then next steps that you can take with you. So first, a little bit about us, Community Science. So we are a national firm that exists to build healthy, just, and equitable communities. We have a number of service areas, including strategy development and improvement. And we conduct these services in a number of practice areas that you see to the right, including organizational effectiveness, health equity, and youth leadership. Many of these examples may come up today. And I'm going to introduce you to your town hall leaders. And first is, I'm so happy to have Dr. Rhea Williams-Bishop back here again. And so Rhea is the Director of Mississippi and New Orleans Programming for the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, based in Battle Creek, Michigan. In this role, she supports the foundation's efforts to promote thriving children, working families, and equitable communities. And Rhea is responsible for leadership and vision in program conceptualization, design, planning, management, coordination, communication, evaluation policy, and learning from grant making in Mississippi and New Orleans. That's a lot. Rhea supports and facilitates the community change process within the region in alignment with the foundation's mission and strategic framework, and works in partnership with grantees and other partners in the region and with other Kellogg Foundation staff. I am also really happy to thank you for being here, Rhea. And I want to also welcome back Jillian Rosen, the Vice President for Community Investment at Aroba Area Community Foundation. As in this role, Jillian oversees the foundation's impact investing, grant-making programs, community initiatives, and strategic partnerships. After earning her BA in anthropology at the University of Maryland, right next door to where I am, Jillian worked in the nonprofit sector and on issues around social justice, poverty alleviation, and youth engagement in philanthropy. Her initial experience in the nonprofit sector made clear her understanding of systemic injustice, and it fueled her desire to go back to school for an MBA and a master's in nonprofit professional leadership at Brandeis University. And after moving to Ann Arbor, Michigan, she joined the Community Foundation, and given the fit with her understanding of strategy, people, and what makes communities thrive. Thank you again for being here. After Rhea and Jillian joined the last webinar, I warned them I'm going to recruit them for the follow-up, and they actually agreed to come back. And now I want to welcome Sir William Buster, our third town hall leader and Senior Vice President of Impact, currently at the Dogwood Health Trust. William is a North Carolina native who has built a career in philanthropy. At Dogwood, he leads the foundation's impact team and ensures that the foundation repeatedly lives up to its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. William provides oversight for the foundation's grant-making and program-related investment strategies, including leading the design, development, delivery, and evaluation of Dogwood's work. He also provides oversight to ensure grants and program-related investments match the strategic direction established by the board and ensure that programs are achieving the desired outcomes. Welcome, William. Really happy to have you here. And let's see, we are going to kick it off. My name is Anand Dalakia, your host and practitioner, currently serving as a principal associate at Community Science. And I've been in the field working on equity and justice for almost 2 decades now. And first as a strategist, developing strategies and working on strategic planning, providing capacity building support for a range of organizations, facilitating groups towards shared goals, and working on evaluation, measurement, and learning. And most often I'm doing a little combination of all of that together in any one particular situation. So we're happy to have everyone here. The town hall leaders, I'm so glad to have you here. Everybody just keep the chat line open and ready to throw in your questions and challenges as we go. I am going to kick it off with a quick grounding in what we mean by strategy, what we mean by equity and justice. That'll be a little bit helpful. So the first thing to share with you is where and how does your strategy show up? And at a very high level, we see strategy as defining, making decisions around your priorities, where you allocate your attention and resources, the goals that you will achieve, the actions you will take to achieve those goals, the actions in the path toward those goals, and also how you conduct various practices, such as grant making, conducting programs and initiatives, etc. Where does that show up? The most obvious place is in a strategic plan or in the planning process. And it can also show up, strategy also shows up in your theory of change or logic model, if you have one defined. It shows up in how you conduct your grant making, how those decisions are made and the practices around that, and also in how you approach more targeted programs and initiatives. Right? So if it's a capacity building program, leadership development program, there's strategy inherent in that, right? Even if it's not made explicit. The next grounding is what we mean by equity and justice, and how community defines it is in 3 parts. First is that by equity and justice, we mean that all people can participate, prosper, reach their full potential, regardless of race, first and foremost, other demographic characteristics, and place of residence. Second part is we will have that equity and justice when people, especially from communities that are historically disadvantaged and excluded, have these 3 things. Number 1, fair access to opportunities and resources. Number 2, the rights to obtain them as respected by the law and free from discrimination. And number 3, the capacity to take advantage of them. Part 3, finally, is to achieve equity and justice requires this: recognizing how our institutions, systems, policies, and narratives have perpetuated inequities and injustice for generations, either knowingly or unintentionally, and addressing the power differences behind these patterns. Right? So all 3 of those parts are important. All 3 of those feed into how we see effective strategy for advancing equity and justice. And based on that, right, based on those two groundings, we're going to throw out a rhetorical question. And we did actually ask you this as a real question in the registration form, but for now, rhetorical, based on those two groundings, consider how well is your strategy advancing equity and justice right now, wherever it may show up, right? Whether it shows up in a strategic plan, in a theory of change, in how you're conducting grant making. Okay? Now, we're going to go into now what strategy for equity and justice looks like. In prior content that we put out, we did detail a number of traps, 7 common strategy traps that very often show up in the typical strategic planning approach in philanthropy, in the nonprofit sector. And we also detailed what basic good strategy looks like, right? And this is regardless of looking at equity and justice at all. There's a few good rules of thumb. The third, the part of that progression is now moving to strategy for equity and justice. And in what we will share after this webinar, we outline 5 principles. We're going to go through each of those one at a time, and one or two at a time. And I'm going to give you a very brief overview, and then ask the town hall leaders to weigh in on how this looks in real life, right? In their foundation's work, in their work with grantees, and with their work with communities. Okay? So we're going to start with principle 1. And after each principle, I'm going to stop and ask people for put in their questions and challenges. Okay? And for anyone who hasn't done so, for anyone who's with us, please do, if you haven't, just put in your introduction into the chat box. All of the panelists will be monitoring to see who's here. And so please let them know your name, your organization, what you are hoping to get out of this webinar. Out of this town hall session. So principle 1 for in looking at strategy for equity and justice, it's a little more basic in concept, but it is fundamental and it comes first for a reason. And the principle is to lead with equity and justice. It's not just a checkbox. And 3 parts of this to highlight are: number 1 is to embrace equity and justice as an end goal. Embrace it as being core to a range of issues, right? Whether we're talking about health, education, economic opportunity, food security, et cetera. It's core to all of those and more. And to see it as having value and benefit for all people, as in all communities, in all people, and having ripple benefits in that way. The second part is to, reinforcing that, is to honor communities as the source of solutions, right? Because of lived experience and inherent assets. And number 3 is to check our own assumptions, biases, and mindsets around those communities. And so these 3 things that are parts, we see as parts of leading with equity and justice, putting that front and center when developing a strategy wherever it shows up and making those decisions. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to our town hall leaders, and 1 to 2 or 3 of you to start with this question about how do you do this? Do you do this? Right? How does equity and justice show up in those strategy decisions around how you allocate your resources, time, attention, how you make grants, et cetera? What does that look like? Take us, give us some top examples of what that looks like in real life, and how does it show up, and any challenges in doing that. Let's start there.
I'll start. First, let me say thank you for the invite to be a part of the conversation. And I'm looking at the list of attendees and I'm seeing old friends. So it's good to see a lot of the folks that I know still in the work. And always good to see friends like Rhea and all the folks at Community Science. So thank you for inviting me. the way it shows up for us. So we are a relatively new philanthropy. We celebrated our second birthday on February 1st of this year, and but what attracted me to this organization was that the board, from its inception, talked about equity being centered. All right, within our work. Now, I could say that we probably didn't fully understand what that meant, centering equity, because there was no definition. Like, you have to have a shared definition of what equity is to know what you're centering. But that said, I will say that how it's showing up for us is I've asked our team that when they are considering sources of funding work, I'm asking them to ask several questions of themselves. Who does this benefit most? Who asked for this? I.e., is it a nonprofit, or is it truly coming from something that's been generated by the community? And where is this coming from? Is it a community that's been flushed with resources, or is it one that truly has been left on the margins? How long the issue has been an issue for that community? And then the last thing we ask, what is the way in which what's the best way to support a body of work? And what I mean by that is, many times organizations that are small, they can't take on, by the fact that they're small, their budgets, they can't take on a lot of resources. But that helps to perpetuate inequity oftentimes, because you can't. And so what we're beginning to kind of talk about and to try to find ways to do is to support that work in an equitable way. So that means philanthropy has to become more innovative. So we're talking about collective support. How do we then, if there's a body of work that a grassroots organization is trying to seek help, and you know it's going to take more than $20,000 to support that work, how do you encourage them to partner with other organizations? So how do you find ways to support the work through institutions or organizations that are trusted by the community but can take on larger grants? So for us, we're trying to bake this into our work overall. And the other thing that I'll say, just from an internal perspective, and I'll be quiet, is that we're asking ourselves the question, how do people who are from varying backgrounds get to show up at work from an equitable perspective? Not just diversity. And let me be clear about that. When we talk about equity, we're talking about how people view the world, their worldview, and how their worldview, how we are supportive of how they bring their worldview into their work. And we create space for the ways in which they bring their worldview into their work, which means then that the kinds of questions that we get from staff will be different, that may not make everybody feel comfortable. The ways in which we value how people come to work, go to work, who they feel comfortable in having conversations with, how they're bringing other kinds of organizations into the work that maybe have been traditionally left out. So their worldview is just as valuable as the degree that they may bring into the work. So I'll be quiet there, and if there's any questions, I'd love to hear the dialogue about that.
Thank you, William. You raised a number of things I'd love to follow up on a little bit later, and this is, let me encourage the audience, definitely, as you hear, if you want to dig into anything that the town hall leaders are sharing, feel free. The chat line is open. Chat line. It sounds like we're on a radio talk show or telethon or something like that, but it's open to weigh in. And if we're not able to address everything within this next 45 minutes, we have ways to do follow-up. So thank you, William. And then Rhea, Jillian, want to share your They're
Sure,
yours.
sure, Anon. So good to see everyone on. Enjoyed the last time we were together, and thank you for the invite. A pleasure to be with William and then with Jillian again. You know, when you think about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, it's almost like equity was baked in 1930 when we began under the leadership of Mr. Kellogg. Even, you know, our mission statement, our values all include equity around serving children, communities, and families. And so we've been able to build on that legacy. So I want to remind you all that is definitely a journey. This equity piece is a journey. It is not a marathon or a sprint. After our founding, fast forward with 30 years, around the late 1960s, we started out supporting HBCUs. Then in the 80s, grant making in underserved communities and in South Africa. Then the 90s, and some of this work, William played a major role in Mississippi and throughout the South. Black men and boys of color, establishing a diversity committee within the foundation. 1990, mid-1990s, Native American higher education supports were put in place and youth engagement. And then you move on, 2007, I think, was a pivotal turning point when the foundation declared itself an anti-racist organization. I think that really fueled the fire for us to get into even more equity and justice pursuits in our grant making. The way we operated, moved into the America Healing Initiative in 2010, developed toolkits, established and trained healing practitioners. And then fast forward to 2016, we reached out and started the Racial Equity Anchors, and the business case for racial equity launched the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation work and the National Day of Healing. And so, you know, with each one of those iterations of work, we've grown, we've listened to the community, we've listened to diverse team members, consultants like Community Science who have worked with us and consistently and continually work to get better and better at this thing we call equity and justice. It's the only way we can do the work. So I'll stop there. Jillian, if you have anything to.
Great to be here with you all. Lovely to meet you, William. Rhea, always a pleasure. I feel like I'm always learning anytime we get on a call together. So let's do more of these. I think I'm going to share with something that didn't work, that helped us get to a place where we are now, which is still nascent on the journey. But, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, I got, you know, I started doing more reading and learning and immersing in what is anti-racism, what does racial inequity look like, for what does it mean in me, how am I part of this system, how is the work that am I doing part of the system, and certainly fired up, had a little bit of knowledge, which was probably really dangerous, and thought that, okay, in my sphere of influence, I can start in our grant making, and I can start transforming our grant making to be centered or anchoring in equity. And it didn't work at all. There was like fits and starts. It actually created spaces of harm for communities when we were not all in, and we were, I might have been all in, but we weren't all in as an institution. But I thought, like, oh, if we can get our grant making going, right, we can prove to people this works. There's a case here, there's an opportunity, and our communities are thriving. And it didn't work. It totally crashed and burned on multiple iterations. And so I would say that we are now on this journey as an integrated organization, in close relationship with communities, because our board took the time to understand what its values are, and in 2020 adopted equity as a core value. And doesn't matter how many books I read, how many books my team was reading, the work we were doing, until we got our governance structure, who holds the power in our institution to be open and embracing of equity and justice, we really weren't going to go anywhere, and we weren't really helping community by trying to do it sort of on the outside and bring it in to the inside. So I guess what I would just say there is it's got to be a whole enterprise initiative and embracing of, and I can attest to when it's not, it just doesn't go anywhere. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Also, three little bit different perspectives, and I think it's clear that I love this work is a journey, not a marathon or a sprint, and it's clear that the three of you are at different places in that journey, or your institutions that you're serving on behalf of are at different places in that journey. And I just want to highlight for now this importance of having a grounding in communities, and also, and that we have a number of questions and comments around what that, having examples of that. And we also, I want to highlight this, and this rang out, and then someone else followed up on it in the chat, is there a difference between anti-racism and focusing on equity and justice, or racial equity and justice? How is this anti-racism focus, is that different? Or how does it look different? And I think there's a particular importance, kind of given the moment in history that we are in right now, at this time of, if you want to call it a mass awakening, mass reckoning around the issues of systemic racism, anti-Black racism, that started about a year ago. The last time we did this webinar was the 1-year anniversary. It was at the time of the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. Here we are a few months later, and it seems like we're still at this peak of attention. But let me throw that out just to all of you, is that in looking at everything that you just described, how is an anti-racism focus different, if at all?
I'd like to, I go back to the person who actually started the work at Kellogg, with Gail Christopher, and Gail and I used to have conversations about the difference between focusing on equity and healing and being anti. And so for me, the framing is as long as you are articulating what you are against, and this is not a knock on anti-racism work, because Ibrahim is a friend of mine. Ibrahim Kendi is a friend of mine, so I'm not knocking the approach. I'm just articulating how I view it. In my mind, as long as I'm articulating what I'm against, I'm not putting forward specifically what I'm trying to achieve. And so the anti-racism work, though it is appropriate for some, I think the difference for me is that when I talk about justice, when I talk about equity, when I talk about healing, those are the things in which I actually want to be supporting and a part of. And so that's just a real kind of high level way in which I do my own analysis around it.
Yes, and William, I appreciate you pointing that out, because if we look at the Kellogg Foundation's timeline, when the board declared the foundation an anti-racist organization, Dr. Christopher was in the process of shifting us to looking at more healing practices and moving us toward the truth, racial healing, and reconciliation piece. I look at the anti-racist piece as, I think, the first step of acknowledgement. So it kind of gets into the next principle 2 that you haven't shared yet, but the Baldwin quote comes to mind. not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so that's how I view the anti-racist piece. Then you get into the, developing your methods or your strategies around racial equity. And it's being intentional about the conversation. Having the conversations is that's the first step, I think, to truly seeking the racial equity that we aspire to, the healing that we aspire to. You have to have those hard conversations, and you have to address the issues with urgency. I think part of the aftermath, or what we're facing in light of the murder of George Floyd is, we definitely don't see this as a one-time thing, a one-shot effort. It's something that has to be continual if we really are serious about racial equity.
Thank you. I'm going to use that as a segue to the next principle too. And I'm going to note that there are a number of questions around equity outcomes and participatory grant making and working with communities that I believe will be definitely be raised in principles 3 and 4. And we know, how I know how each of you is doing that and have done that. And so I'm going to flag those questions for then. For now, let's go to principle 2. And just a note is that all of us, the 4 of us, discussed that we could do probably several hours on each one of these principles, but we're going to try to cram them all into this 1 hour in the interest of time. And so we'll get through as much as we can, and you know how it goes. So, but principle 2, recognize the big problem to solve. Starting with that leading with equity and justice. And for us, it comes down to these 2 things. Name why disparities exist in the first place, as in hints to systems. And number 2 is recognize what keeps them in place. That second part is also very important. And I'm going to run through this quick illustration and then bring it back to all of you. So what we had done last time. So the quick one, here's one way of looking at it, right? To see the role of systems in perpetuating disparities based on how we have defined it. So if we imagine that most of us go through some version of these stages of life, right, from the early years all the way through older adulthood. As we go through that, we have many shared core needs, right? Food, housing, transportation, having a community, sense of community. We also know that there is a great deal of disparities all along that lifespan, everything from disparities in school readiness, in employment, and wealth. There's also a great deal of disparities in core needs. And when we say who's facing disparities, it's the communities that are historically disadvantaged and excluded. And to address those disparities, a lot of our work, right, Philanthropy's work, is on strengthening, providing programs to help people, and I'm going to quote Jillian, to help people beat the odds, right? And so everything from home visiting programs, job training programs, et cetera, and also a number of programs that help people address core needs when they are not met. Okay. So part of principle 2 now is looking underneath as to what's the systemic pattern happening that is contributing to these disparities up top. And here we see the role of systems. And so again, from birth, the early years through older adulthood, we see, based on a whole lot of research and evidence, is communities have lower access to quality early education, lower access to quality jobs. If you're applying for a job, you're half as likely to get a call back even if your resume suggests that you are a person of color. And so all of this has been shown across the lifespan. And we know that systemically there's lower access to core needs. We have mass patterns like mass incarceration, et cetera. And the last piece is, so that's number 1, is recognizing the role of systems as perpetuating disparities. The last part of this is understanding that second part is why do systems behave this way, right? We need to understand that if we hope to change them. And so a few highlights around patterns of why that is so. We're recognizing that communities have very limited decision power over how systems behave, policies, procedures, practices, legislation, you name it. We know there's a history of ubiquitous systemic racism that is showing up as all of these behaviors up top. And we know there have been consistent negative narratives, many of them stemming from racism and developed to reinforce racism, negative narratives around those very communities, which makes it even harder to have decision-making power. And all of this is in place. We explicitly recognize there are incentives for systems to operate exactly as they are, right? To maintain the status quo. We recognize that there is no such thing as a broken system. It's operating according to how those incentives function, and then also fear of loss that certain individuals in power over systems may be facing. Right? And so principle 2 is focusing on this, right? The bottom part of this picture. Right? And when we talk about equity and justice strategy, it's strategy to looking into all places where your strategy shows up to deal with that. What to do about this problem, we'll get to in the next principle, right? The next 2 principles. But for now, I'm going to turn it back to William, Jillian, and Rhea to share how do you look at this picture? How do you consider the role of systems, dig underneath it, right? Work that into your any decisions that you're making around, right, how your foundation operates. I'm going to leave this. I'll leave this picture up for a little bit.
I don't want to. I feel like I'm talking too much. I'll be real quick. I'll share something. That's
why you're here.
I think that even when you do strategic place-based philanthropy, right, you have to have, I call a vertical integration of approaches. The condition of the community is what it is, and to ignore the current condition is to ignore the humanity of those folks, right? And so if there is need to support work around access to food, emergency access to food, emergency access to healthcare, feeding programs for elders, to ignore those things because that's the current condition means you are not truly understanding the dynamics of what's happening in that community. But that does not say that because that's a form of charity, and some people use charity as a bad word. I don't. I view it as a part of the system. I view it as a part of the vertical integration of philanthropy. So and so you have to have that aspect of the work. Now the question becomes how much of that becomes your work. So for some foundations, that's 90% of their work. For some foundations, that's 10% of their work. But you have to have a way in which you view the world, especially, and I'm talking about strategic place-based philanthropy. Nothing else. I don't know about what other folks are doing. But you have to then understand that if that is the current condition, at each level of what you presented here around the big picture, then what is the next thing up from that will help alleviate that downstream impact that those folks are having to deal with. And so for me, it's a question about proportion. How much of your organization are you going to lend towards tackling the systemic issues? But that also means then you have to make some real hard decisions about time, resources, right? And I don't mean just grant resources. I'm talking about staff resources. To tackle these systemic issues takes a lot of brain space and time. And so you have to allocate the appropriate amount of time. So I would say for foundations, and this may be heresy for some foundations, doing those direct service programs, which all you're doing is count numbers, make it extremely easy for folks to get grants in that space. it's there's hardly any review. If you want to do a food pantry, submit your proposal. Let's fund that work by next week. That takes away the time that it takes. So you're also articulating to the community where you find the importance. There's nothing more maddening than a foundation that makes somebody fill out a report about a damn food feeding program that they did, just like they would ask them to kind of do a report around a strategy that's multi-layered. Make the work appropriate to the level of impact that you're having. So I'll be quiet there, and yeah, I'll shut up now.
I love that.
You're apologizing too much. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe. You want to follow up? Let me know that.
Yeah, I mean,
thank you for calling
snaps
out. Right.
on that for sure. So for me, for the foundation, I like when I show up, people are going to know that I'm going to bring the statistics and the data that are going to make them uncomfortable. So for example, in our community, we are 350,000 people. We have 5 institutes of higher education. 40% of our neighbors are asset limited, income stream trained, and employed. And there's a 20-year lifespan gap based on race and geography. And to me, I bring that I carry, some maybe call it baggage, but I call it my ammunition, because I feel like the big picture is stoking dissatisfaction with the status quo. And the big picture we should be dissatisfied with. There's persistent inequities that we're all contributing to. And so I feel like the calling is to use the knowledge that we have, to seek it out, to verify it. And then we have to just bring it into every conversation that we're in. The spaces that I can enter, I need to use the fact that I have access to those spaces to people with influence and power, and make sure they are armed with that same knowledge so that they can become champions as much as I am, as the foundation is. So if that means we have to commission original research about our community, then that's how we're going to use our dollars. If it means one of my staff member now goes to almost all Board of Commissioner meetings, specifically looking at our aging commission, and is there as both an observer, but also to speak on the data and to make sure that we are holding accountable our public institutions for the work that they say they're going to do, and also we should be held accountable too, right? It's a mutual relationship of accountability, and so I think that it's using the data and using the knowledge we have and just putting it out there all the time. I sometimes joke I'm like the Debbie Downer when I show up to meetings, but that's okay. I'm going to do that because I am totally dissatisfied with the status quo right now. And so if that's the role I can play, then that's the role that I can contribute to our community of change. And also giving others a platform to speak on this. It's not just my voice. If I can use my space to and bring someone else in and share that space to also be evangelizing on what's happening in our community to make that picture real and alive, then that's the ways that I feel like we as the foundation can do that.
So Anand, before we leave this one, I just want to give an example. So I agree with what both William and Jillian have said. We worked to make a huge grant to the Jackson Public School District to help keep them from conservatorship, takeover by the state. Well, as soon as we make the grant, there's a water crisis. If you don't have water, the school can't function, businesses can't function. So at some point you may have your strategy, you may have the box for your strategy, okay? You have targets to meet, you're doing all this, but you have to leave some space for immediate community needs that are going to ultimately throw your targets and throw your strategic planning out of the water if you can't take care of what the community says they need at a particular time and place. So there's a delicate balance. You have to deal with, meeting what you set out as your strategy, but without the community's input, you'll go nowhere. You have to make sure you listen to community, and I call it finding the sweet spot, where the community needs and the grantees and organizations you're working with make known what their immediate needs are, and then look at what you're trying to achieve in terms of your targets or your goals or your strategy. That's the sweet spot for funding. So I'll stop there so we can make it through the 7 principles.
Yeah, can you, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So both of you called out, and I want to lift that up, right? The importance of meeting communities where they are, addressing today's needs, and at the same time, then adding a focus, which is often overlooked, right, is to the systems piece, and then that balance, that's definitely part of strategy decisions. So I did want to lift that part up. Some of this will come up in this next principles, and for sake of time, this hour is going really fast, and I'm glad it feels like a mini reunion between everyone who's in the chat and then you all, and then the people who are in the chat. But I'm going to just blow through the last 3 principles very fast, and then just bring it back to you. All right. So looking at that systems picture, right, is just given the state of things and why systems stay the way they do, begs the question, okay, how do I change such a picture? So principle 3 follows on that with prioritizing what makes change happen. And here one part of the principle is to shape a macro strategy around change levers that address the big problem, and then using those change levers to guide supporting investments, quickly show what those can look like. The first is, we talked a lot about community, right? First strategies, working on community engagement and power, strengthening community capacity connections to shape systems. And that includes meeting communities where they are and providing services to address needs through that process. Spreading messages to shape the current negative narratives around communities. Number 3, advocating for improved policies and their implementation driven by community priorities, right? And 4th is showing a bold vision for transformation, reinventing of systems with concrete models and data to back them up. And then lastly, last change lever is targeting those points where systems decisions are made. Jillian mentioned the Board of Commissioners, and that's one point. And then looking at the second part of this is looking at these change levers as a way to guide how your foundation might be taking on any programs, initiatives in any one of these areas at the bottom, right? If you're taking on a capacity building program, a program to help organizations collaborate, et cetera. William, you mentioned this issue with not wanting to support organizations that are deemed too small, right? And which is very common, right? They may lack the capacity to meet certain grant criteria, but that can perpetuate inequities. We see that a lot in capacity building programs and how programs look at criteria for which grantee organizations will qualify for this program. Oh, you have to have a certain minimal level of capacity to get into this because we want to make sure you have the capacity to use the supports, right? That's perpetuating some inequities, and it's a very, very typical approach. So that's all I'm going to say about that one, and we'll move to principle 4. It's basically, as you're looking at the change levers, look outside the foundation to see who's doing what, especially who's addressing the big problem and pushing on the change levers, and seeing how to best contribute, right, versus looking out there for what can contribute back to your foundation. Consider the multiple roles that your foundation can play, and then thinking how the work drills down to a local level where communities live, right? Neighborhoods, cities, towns, even if you're working at the state level and nationally. And last thing is principle 5, this big idea of risk. There's a lot of idea of risk inherent in all of this work, right? And so the last principle is to remove some limitations that may be false and to stretch the comfort zone, especially when making this decision about how much of my resources are going to go into the systems change bucket, for example, or how much of my resources are going to organizations that I have not tended to grant to in the past. Right, so this includes adopting this principle, includes assessing current policies, practices, procedures, and looking at those risks that may be perceived and compare that to the risk of continuing life as it is, right? Status quo, everything stays the same. And then go back to checking those underlying mindsets, right? What's feeding those perceptions of risk to those historically underfunded groups that are led by people of color, for example. Right, and then explicitly naming these boundaries that need to be pushed. All of that is kind of, it can be a hurdle, right, that prevents investing in anything else. And so we wanted to name that. We hear about this a lot. So I'm going to stop there. I'm done. So now it comes back to you to bring us home with examples of what has it looked like to do this work, to invest in it, make those decisions. And especially, we love stories. We don't have that much time left, but we'll definitely appreciate stories and any particular learnings that you've had in going through that process that each of you has been going through.
So Anand, I'll jump in with a particular story. It kind of ties in principle 3, 4, and 5. And it's more internal. It's not necessarily external, talking about grantees, but it was helping get us there. When I first arrived at the foundation and we had team members assigned to the priority place of Mississippi and New Orleans, and we also had some staff members in Battle Creek, Michigan, my thought was, okay, I'm sure everybody has had some encounter, spent some time in the South, familiar with the history of the South as it relates to racial equity, and found that was not the case. So I partnered with another team, and we literally got on a bus, started at Little Rock, Arkansas, at Little Rock Central High School, came down through Memphis to the National Civil Rights Museum, the Emmett Till sites, all the way down to New Orleans to the Whitney Plantation. And it was certainly an eye-opener. And so I say that to give you an example of the effort and the resources taken to pull that trip together and make it real for the people who are actually making the decisions about grants in those places in the South, in our priority places. And I tell you, I had team members say that they looked at the work completely different after that process. And that's what it takes. We have to make sure that we do everything we can to meet communities where they are. And what goes along with that is understanding the history, the culture, the preconditions, because there are certain things that have to be addressed before you can get to whatever that bigger systems change is. And Brian Stevenson puts it best, proximity. You have to be proximate to the people in which you are serving. And give you one additional example, the flag issue in the state of Mississippi. Had we not chosen to reach out and partner with some members of the business community who did not necessarily see this as a problem, help work with grassroots folks to say, this is a problem, this is hindering our economic growth in the state of Mississippi, and do something about it. And it happened, but it took reaching out to some unlikely partners to get us to the tipping point for that to occur.
Great story. I'm going to ask Jillian to weigh in. I did want to note that that Cynthia talked about risk and saying that there's a lot of learning can come from failure, right? And so which can involve taking risks. I think we've noted that foundations can see these investments, can avoid these investments sometimes altogether because there's a risk of not showing impact, right? Or, oh, it's a risk that our grant dollars are not going to be well used with these organizations, et cetera. But I think the failure point is a great one. We often talk about the importance of conflict arising and addressing that conflict as a sign of progress, right? And that can happen inside, outside. Jillian and William, please weigh in. And just a logistical note, if anyone can stay. Last time, I think we went 20 minutes late, and a whole bunch of people just stayed on. And I can stay a few minutes late if there's still conversation. Rhea, Jillian, William, we'll keep it open. You know, if you need to leave, you need to leave. But Jillian, William, I'm going to ask you to, as you're sharing your story and learning, also please just give us one big takeaway for the audience, right, in terms of how to maybe piece of guidance or advice to move forward.
Okay. So something that I grapple with, and it came up actually yesterday on our call, is accepting the paradox of the current conditions of community and abundance. And so in trying to accept those two things are happening right now, and that our job is to help meet community where they are in that paradox to help shift the conditions. And maybe I might be Debbie Downer, but I'm also a super optimistic person. And I just see that we live and have abundance in our communities, abundance of intellectual capital, abundance of moral capital, abundance of financial capital. And we can make the change so that the current conditions are not what they are, but we have to accept that those two things are in fact happening together. What has really sort of made that more fluid and I think embraced at our foundation actually relates to something one of the attendees brought up, a question around participatory grant making. And sort of our take on participatory grant making is actually to have community voice shape all of our strategy. So strategy is no longer shaped in the box, in the confines of the foundation. It is shaped the fingerprints of community, and us being proximate to community shapes our strategies. Sometimes it results in participatory grant making, but more importantly, it's embedded in the strategy that then our board and our foundation has to be accountable to. And so I would say that fusion has really helped us propel forward and shift towards a mindset of abundance, and that we can do this work. It might seem really challenging, and it is, but we have the resources in our communities to do it.
I'll share just a parting thought as people think about how to best engage philanthropy. You have to, I think, acknowledging the inherent kind of limitations of organized philanthropy is something that I think people have to own, because it's frustrating. I used to be very frustrated in my work early on in my career until I understood that philanthropy operates exactly as it was designed to operate. All right. Philanthropy is not freedom money, as I tell people. And we got to stop thinking of it as that. It's useful. It is it's necessary. People deserve it, the resources within it, but it is not ultimately what the resources are going to change the condition of what happens in our community. We can contribute to moving it in a positive direction, but we have to stop thinking of it as the way in which change will happen. Because at the end of the day, I mean, it's just a very human thing to understand. The only way there's true freedom is if you take it up for yourself. Nothing has ever given anyone freedom. Freedom has been, and justice has been something that people have acquired for themselves. We can be partners in the community. We can be leveragers. We can be door openers. But those are the things in which we should remain in our lane. I think that's the key to understanding what philanthropy is good at, is to know that we have a lane in which we can stay, that we're very good in, and we can do that. That's one thing. I think the other thing is for us in philanthropy and in the way in which this work shows up, unless there's intentional internal work, there is no way in which this work can look and feel the way you expect for it to look and feel, and by the ways in which you're supporting it. I'll never forget, there was I've been at a few foundations, so I'm not going to say which foundation I was at when this was said, but there was I'll never forget one of my colleagues said, as we were talking about doing the work in communities, but we were spending a lot of hours doing that work. The colleague said, oh, I get it. We as an organization care about children, you just don't care about my children. And so it was a reflection of how we worked, and we didn't value people's lives and people's families while we were trying to say that we were changing everybody else's family. And so we have to look out for those contradictions in how we do the work. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I am going to have to go though.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all. And William, I think you addressed a number of other questions in that answer, just being clear on, what role philanthropy can play given the unique position it has, while understanding it is not, it's not going to bring freedom by itself, but can be a partner. And we've been talking about, how to approach that very unique and privileged position and make the best of it. I can kind of given the state of things. And thank you for everyone who's sharing resources. And let's see, we have Jillian, Lori, and Lori Fuller, and let's see, Lori Villarosa. Thank you all, and definitely please others share as well. And we're going to wrap it up. This went really fast, isn't it? So the last thing I'm going to share, just to close this out, thank you all so much for joining us again and spending this hour, this afternoon with us. Last few things to wrap up are, again, we'll definitely share the recording and relevant resources that we've all put together. And a few takeaways is that we do see equity and justice strategies helping these calls to action for helping those imperatives and recommendations become realized. When we think about what companies and mayors and policymakers and police departments need to do better for communities. And a few steps to consider in moving forward is to see how you're doing, pay more attention to systems and change levers, pay attention to who's pushing those change levers in your communities, and then checking those risks and mindsets that may be holding you back. Right? And we did the Q&A, we're out of time, and last is just a big thank you for everyone who was able to join us. And so am I sharing this at all? Oh, that didn't even share it, did it? You did not see it. So that is all.